My cruel supervisor said you're not smart enough for a promotion. Just accept your place. I smiled and nodded. What he didn't know was that I was finalizing the deal to buy the entire company. The next day when he saw me walk in, as his new boss, his knees went weak. His smirk was unbearable. Scott Weston, my direct supervisor, the man who had taken every chance to belittle me over the last 4 years, leaned back in his chair, arms folded across his chest. The arrogance stripped from his voice as he spoke. "Olivia," he said, dragging out my name like it exhausted him to say it, "do you really think you're management material?" I sat across from him, hands resting lightly on my lap, calm as ever. But inside, I was memorizing this moment, the moment before everything changed. He didn't wait for me to answer. He never did. "You work hard, sure, I'll give you that. But leadership isn't about working hard. It's about vision, confidence." His fingers drummed against the desk, his ring clicking against the polished wood. "And, no offense, but you just don't have it." He shrugged. "Some people are meant to lead, and some people are meant to support. That's just how the world works." A silence settled between us, thick and suffocating. I saw the way his lips curled in satisfaction, as if he was doing me a favor by telling me to stay in my place. And that's when I smiled. Not a forced, polite smile. Not a submissive, defeated smile. A real one. Because while he sat there, bloated with confidence, I was already signing the final paperwork that would make me his new boss. He just didn't know it yet. So I gave him exactly what he wanted. A nod, a smile, and a quiet, "Of course, Mr. Weston. I understand completely." I stood, smoothed my skirt, and turned toward the door. And as I walked away, I thought to myself, enjoy your last days of power, Scott. Because soon, you'll be on your knees. I wasn't some genius who got lucky. I had fought for this moment. 2 years of planning. 2 years of strategic positioning. 2 years of patience. The company, Westford Enterprises, was rotting from the inside. The CEO, a tired old man who had lost his grip on reality, was desperate to cut his losses. The board members were restless, watching as profits declined and employee morale collapsed under Scott's leadership. They needed an exit strategy, and I was the only one who had the answer. I had spent years studying the financials, building connections with influential investors and proving myself to the right people. Quietly, strategically, Scott thought I was just an obedient worker, but I had played my role too well. Because while he spent his time tormenting employees, stealing credit, and embezzling money, I had been making moves. And now, I was about to own it all. I let him enjoy his last moments of power. That week, Scott walked through the office like a king in his castle. He belittled an intern in a meeting, calling her idea laughable. He dismissed a senior analyst's research, even though it was brilliant. He looked me in the eyes at least twice and said, "You should be grateful, Olivia. Not everyone gets the stability you have here." I smiled each time because by the time he realized what I had done, it would be too late. Friday morning, Scott strolled in, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, barely acknowledging the people who worked beneath him. But something was different today. The air was too quiet. He noticed. His steps slowed, his brow furrowed. And then, the CEO walked out of his office. "Scott," he said, voice grim, "we need to talk." Scott scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What now?" The CEO didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't ease the tension. "There's been a change in leadership," he said flatly. "Westford Enterprises has been acquired." Silence. Scott blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Acquired? What the hell are you talking about?" The moment had arrived. I stepped forward. Scott froze. I took my time walking toward him, letting the sound of my heels echo across the silent room. Then, I stopped, lifted my chin, and said, "Good morning, Mr. Weston." His entire body stiffened. I smiled. "I'm looking forward to working with you." His face drained of color. He looked from me to the CEO, then back to me, as if reality itself had betrayed him. This is a joke," he stammered. "This isn't real." "Oh, it's very real." I handed him the official shareholder report. His trembling fingers barely managed to flip through the pages before his eyes landed on my name. "Olivia Carter, majority shareholder." The paper slipped from his hands. "You should have paid attention, Scott," I said, my voice cool but not cruel. "While you were too busy keeping me in my place, I was building my empire." He took a step back, then another. Panic flickered in his eyes. And then in a whisper, "You planned this. For a very long time." Silence. Then I leaned in just slightly. "But don't worry, I'm not like you." His eyes snapped up to mine. "I won't humiliate you." I continued. "I won't treat you the way you treated me." Scott swallowed hard. "I'm giving you a choice." His jaw clenched. "A choice?" I nodded. "You can stay. But you work under me now. And if you ever treat another employee the way you treated me, you're out." The room held its breath. And for the first time, Scott Weston was powerless. The silence in the room was thick, the kind that felt like it had weight, pressing down on everyone present. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard from a few cubicles down, the distant ring of a phone somewhere in the background. But inside this conference room, nothing moved. Scott stood there, his breathing shallow, his hands gripping the chair in front of him as though he needed to physically steady himself. His usual smirk, the one he wore like armor, was completely gone. "You can't be serious," he muttered, voice raw. His gaze flickered to the CEO, searching for some kind of lifeline. But the older man merely sighed, adjusting his tie. "It's done, Scott," the CEO said, rubbing his temples. "The deal was finalized last night. Olivia is now the majority shareholder." Scott let out a short, humorless laugh, but it cracked at the edges. This is insane. She's an assistant, for God's sake." I raised an eyebrow. "Was an assistant?" He flinched. "I spent years in this company." I continued, taking my time with my words. "I worked under you, watched you, learned every single flaw in this business, every weakness. I knew what needed to change. And while you spend your time mocking me, I was making connections. I was building something much bigger than you ever realized." Scott's jaw tightened, but I saw the first true signs of defeat in his expression. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. "How?" He exhaled sharply, gripping his forehead. "How the hell did you even afford this? Who in their right mind backed you?" I smiled, slow and deliberate. "People who believe in actual leadership," I said simply. Scott's fingers clenched into a fist. "You have no experience running a company of this size." I tilted my head, enjoying the irony. "And yet, here I am." A faint murmur rippled through the gathered employees. I could feel the eyes of the entire office on us, watching, waiting. Scott was crumbling, and for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to run. Scott's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "You're going to fire me." I let the words hang between us for a moment. I saw the anticipation in the room, the unspoken hope on the faces of employees who had suffered under him for too long. Then, I exhaled. "No," I said. Shock flickered across his face. "No. You heard me." I folded my arms. "I'm not firing you, Scott." His confusion was palpable. He searched my face for some kind of cruel trick, some hidden agenda. "Then what the hell are you doing?" I took a slow step forward. "I'm giving you a chance," I said evenly. "To stay. To learn. To finally understand what it means to be a leader instead of a tyrant." Scott scoffed, shaking his head, but I saw the uncertainty in his eyes. "You spent years pushing people down," I continued, my tone never wavering. "I want to see if you have it in you to rise the right way." A heavy silence. Then, from behind us, a quiet voice. "That's more than he deserves." Heads turned. It was Daniel, one of the senior analysts who had been under Scott's iron grip for years. He looked straight at me, his expression firm but curious. And behind him, others nodded. Scott Weston had burned every bridge in this office. And yet, here I was, offering him a lifeline. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "And if I refuse?" I gave him a smile. "Then you walk out that door, and I replace you by Monday." I held out my hand. "So, what's it going to be?" For the first time in his life, Scott Weston wasn't in control. Scott didn't answer me right away. In fact, he didn't speak at all. His shoulders stiffened, his breathing uneven. He looked at the room. Really looked, and for once, I think he saw it. The damage, the burned bridges, the resentment in people's eyes. He had spent years ruling with an iron fist. Now, he was nothing more than a disgraced man clinging to whatever scraps of power he had left. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he exhaled sharply and nodded. "Fine." A ripple of shock went through the room. I tilted my head. "Fine. I'll stay," he muttered, his voice low gritted. "I'll learn." A pause. Then, a smirk tugged at my lips. "Good," I said softly, "because you have a lot of unlearning to do." The following weeks were interesting. Scott struggled under my leadership. It was painful for him to take orders from me, the woman he had spent years humiliating. But I made it clear from day one, there would be no more fear, no more intimidation. I restructured teams. I promoted the people Scott had ignored. I implemented policies that gave employees the respect they deserved. And Scott? Scott had to watch his kingdom transform. He resisted at first. His old habits were hard to break, but every time he slipped up, I reminded him, this wasn't his company anymore. It was mine. And slowly, grudgingly, he started to change. I saw it in the way he listened in meetings instead of talking over people. I saw it in the way he actually apologized to an intern he once humiliated. I saw it in the way he finally understood what it meant to be part of a team. It didn't erase his past, but it was a start. Months later, we stood together in the boardroom, reviewing projections for the company's new direction. Scott was different now. Humbled, he no longer walked like a king. Instead, he walked like a man who had something to prove. And then came the real test. A promotion needed to be made. He looked at me. I looked at him. And then, to my shock, he recommended a woman he had once overlooked, a woman who had earned it. For the first time, Scott Weston understood something he never had before. Power wasn't about keeping people beneath you. It was about lifting the right people up. And as I sat back in my chair, watching him take a step in the right direction, I realized I had won. Not just over Scott, but over the system he represented. And, in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. Scott's change wasn't overnight. People don't change in an instant. It was messy. It was slow. Some days, I saw glimpses of progress. He listened instead of dismissed. He considered instead of ridiculed. Other days, he slipped back into old habits, his voice sharp, his words biting. But every time he did, I made it clear. This isn't how we do things anymore, Scott. And then one day, a real test arrived. A major investor was coming in for a review of the new leadership structure. It was the perfect opportunity to prove that we had turned things around. But there was a problem. Scott, the man who had once ruled this office with arrogance and intimidation, had to stand before this investor and present a project that he had no control over. It was my strategy, my team's execution. His name wasn't on any of it. Would he accept it? Or would his old ego come roaring back? The meeting room was dead silent as Scott took the floor. The investor, Mr. Holloway, was an older man with a calculating stare. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "So, Mr. Weston," he said, "walk me through this new leadership model. I understand things have changed." Scott hesitated, the first real moment of uncertainty I had ever seen from him. He looked at me. I met his gaze evenly. This was the moment. If he tried to seize credit, to take back control, it would prove he hadn't learned a damn thing. The old Scott Weston would have done just that. But after a long pause, he exhaled. "I won't lie," Scott said, his voice rough, but steady. "Change has been difficult for me. I didn't exactly have the best leadership style before." I saw Holloway's eyebrow lift slightly. This was unexpected. Scott continued. "But Olivia has built something stronger here. A company that actually values its people. And while it's been an adjustment, I can't deny that the results speak for themselves." He turned to the screen, gesturing to the data. "This wasn't my plan. I won't pretend it was. But it's working. Productivity is up. Retention is up. Morale is higher than it's ever been." A pause. And then, he looked directly at me. "I've learned a lot under Olivia's leadership." His voice was steady now. "And if I'm being honest, she should have been running this company a long time ago." I blinked. The room was dead silent. And then Holloway chuckled. "Well," the investor said, amused. "That's not what I expected to hear from you, Mr. Weston." Scott exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, me neither." For the first time since I had taken over, I saw something real in Scott's expression. Not fear, not arrogance, respect. And for the first time, I gave it back. After the meeting, I stayed back in my office, staring at the skyline through the glass. The company was thriving. The transition had been painful, but it was working. Then there was a knock. I turned. Scott stood in the doorway, a strange look on his face. He hesitated, then stepped inside. "I've been thinking," he said, clearing his throat, "about everything." I leaned back, crossing my arms, and he exhaled. "I don't deserve this position." I blinked. "Excuse me, I don't deserve to sit at this table." "I never did," he admitted, shaking his head. "I got here by stepping on people, by taking credit for work that wasn't mine. But you actually built something. You earned it." For a moment, I didn't speak, because for the first time, Scott Weston was holding himself accountable. He let out a dry laugh. "Hell, Olivia. I spent years telling you that you weren't smart enough for a promotion. And now, I'm answering to you." His lips twitched. "Karma's a real thing." I smirked. "Looks like it." He hesitated. "I think I should step down. Someone else deserves my spot. Maybe Daniel." I raised a brow. "The same Daniel you ignored for 5 years?" Scott's smile was self-deprecating. "Yeah, him. I studied him carefully. This was the man who had humiliated me, who had controlled this office like a tyrant. And now, he was offering to step down." I tapped my fingers on my desk, and then, slowly, I shook my head. "No." Scott stiffened. "No." I stood walking toward him. "You don't get to take the easy way out, Scott," I said evenly. "You don't get to walk away and act like that's redemption. You want to prove you've changed? Stay. Keep learning. Keep growing. Keep earning the respect you never deserved before." His throat bobbed. You trust me to do that? I held his gaze. No, I said honestly. But, I trust you to try. He swallowed hard, and then, slowly, he nodded. Weeks passed. Scott stayed. And, every day, I watched him. Some days, he still struggled. He still hesitated when he had to take orders from me. But more and more, I saw real change. And then, the moment came. A crisis. A critical project was falling apart. Our lead executive had dropped the ball, and we were hours away from losing millions. The entire office was on edge. And then, out of nowhere, Scott stepped up. Let me handle this, he said, rolling up his sleeves. I can fix it. Everyone stared at him. I studied his face carefully. And then I nodded. Go. For 48 hours, he worked without rest. And when it was over, he saved the deal. For the first time, Scott Weston had proved himself, not as a boss, not as a tyrant, but as a real leader, and I knew he was ready. Months later, we stood together in the office, looking over the new company we had built. I gotta admit, Scott said, crossing his arms, you were right. I smirked. I usually am. He chuckled, shaking his head. So what now, boss? He asked. I turned to him, and then I held out my hand. Now, I said, we build something even better. Scott stared at my hand, and then, for the first time, he shook it. Not as my boss, not as my enemy, but as my equal, and that was the greatest victory of all.